The primary purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. The views, information, or opinions expressed by hosts or guests are their own. Neither the show nor any of its content should be construed as investment advice or as a recommendation to buy or sell any particular security. Security-specific information shared on this podcast should not be relied upon as a basis for your own investment decisions. Be sure to do your own research. The podcast hosts and participants may have a position in the securities mentioned personally through sub-accounts and/or through separate funds and may change their holdings at any time.
Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of This Week in Intelligent Investing. We have another great conversation ahead, this one on the life sciences sector. Elliot, why don't I turn it to you to introduce our special guests today?
Great. Thank you so much, John. I'm very excited for today's guest. Also, John, who is known as Borlaug on Twitter. Writes the Borlaug Substack. I noticed that name because I'd read Charles Mann's Wizard and the Prophet and was fascinated by Borlaug the person. And I was intrigued by the gentleman who would take that pseudonym for Twitter. And I think he's as cool and interesting as one might expect from the character in the book, a real life character. The first blog post I had encountered of John/Borlaug was his rebuttal of Scorpion's short thesis on Twist. And let me just say that John absolutely nailed it, and it was incredible. It was really thorough, right for the right reasons kind of post. John is a specialist in the life sciences, and the life science sector, last week we had coverage of the semiconductor space, and the semiconductor space, outside of that non-AI stuff is really going to the moon. Meanwhile, life sciences couldn't be in a tougher spot right now, which I think makes for a very interesting and timely conversation to pick through the pieces. So with that, John, really excited to have you here today, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Elliot. Great to be here.
All right. So maybe to start, I think it would be helpful because our audience tends to be generalists. Most of the people out here really, one of the things I hear from other generalists is that life sciences fits in what Buffett calls the too hard pile. But I do think there are a lot of ways to demystify the space. And your background, you come not from a PhD science background, but a more general background. So maybe talk about yourself, how you got interested in life sciences, how you're able to demystify this space and kind of find your way.
Yeah, for sure. I started my career and my approach to picking a sector in the effort to kind of avoid having my role quanted away for better or for worse, for naive or less naive. So wanted something that was complex, but still understandable from a finance economics background. And I fixated on healthcare. I suppose I'd be a much happier camper today if I chose tech like everybody else. But I've learned a lot over 7-8 years now about the space. I started focused on medical devices, which was one of those areas that looks like it's investing in drugs, but it's actually a lot simpler once you know the jargon and your way around the space. And since then, I've kind of expanded both my investing aperture to more high quality businesses, and then toward life sciences, as I noticed where a lot of the high quality businesses in healthcare were concentrated was in that ecosystem. The path to learning the space was really, most people say it takes 10,000 hours to master something. I think you could learn the space with 10,000 Google searches. It really is like that. A lot of these things are fancy words for otherwise simple concepts. I would probably compare life sciences actually a lot to industrials and semis. I think happy to elaborate on that, but that's kind of how I think about it. It's industrials and semis with a lot of technical jargon and some regulatory capture changing the dynamics.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little, because when I started in this industry, like semis were a space similar to life sciences today, where typical the average analyst was like, it's too hard, too complex, really fast cycles. Everyone would talk about how Clayton Christensen had just wrote an Innovator's Dilemma not that long ago, used semis because things move so fast and it's just like too hard was what I'd hear. But now every generalist is like, I own NVIDIA or I love semis. So maybe talk about the parallels. I know before we hit record, we talked about how there are even shared heritage amongst a lot of companies that service the semi and life sciences space. Talk about the parallels and talk about what helped you feel confident coming into here.
Yeah, for sure. I think the linkage really starts in chemicals. To make a semiconductor, there are a lot of chemicals involved, a lot of filters involved. It's no different in life sciences. The legacy original drugs, the things that you use today, most of them are in pill form, are really just chemicals. So the way you research and develop those was largely the same, and that's where the overlap really starts. If you think about life sciences more specifically, taking it away from semis for a second, it really is just an odyssey of research and development to a drug. And if you treat drugs like a consumer staple with a huge regulatory element, it starts to make a lot more sense. But the supply chains are very similar. At the end of the process, you have a biopharma company making a drug, but to get there, there has to be research and development. So the odyssey really begins in academia, right? So you have academic labs, nonprofits doing all this research and development, discovering pathways, targets for drugs to hit, and then trying to find drugs that'll hit them. Once those research projects make it far enough along, they'll end up at a company somehow, either being licensed as a startup, spun out as a startup, licensed directly by big pharma, and they start to enter preclinical research and move down the chain from there. Once they're in R&D, they have to go through clinical trials. This is the part where everyone's kind of familiar with phase 1, 2, and 3. And then once that happens, you have commercial. However, there's a lot of nuance to that, right? So I guess the biggest and most misunderstood parts of it are really the academic R&D, biopharma R&D, and when I mean biopharma R&D, I mean basic research, and then the clinical trials themselves. Things start, if you want to compare it to semiconductors and their cyclicality, I think all the cyclicality happens at that R&D phase, right? So drug sales are relatively secular. They're tied to drivers like obesity, aging. Those things have kind of been on a long-term upswing. I think aging is the bigger component of it. So, you could argue obesity drugs can kind of wreck the long-term algorithm. I actually think in the case of pharmaceuticals, it really is tied more to aging. The majority of the spend you incur on the healthcare system happens when you're in your last few years of life. So that part's secular, but the R&D piece really is tied to what big pharma is spending on early stage research, what the venture community is doing in terms of total funding dollars going in. And a lot of that is tied to the performance of biotech companies because they go public so early. So those companies do poorly, VCs don't get exits, those dollars don't flow back into their portfolios for them to redeploy, and that's where you get your cycle. You're witnessing right now another pretty big cycle in big pharma as well, though, where the percent of their sales they're spending on R&D has kind of crept up to a really high level, and they're right-sizing their cost structures today.
So let's help define life sciences a little more, because I think one of the elements I find fascinating about the industry is that there's an ETF for everything. There's an ETF to be like ultra long a stock like MSTR, but there's not a life science ETF, and there's no clear way to find a definition of what the sector is and what sub areas people should be focusing on. So what does life sciences mean to you, and what are the key like sub industries within life sciences when we're talking about this broader umbrella?
Yeah, so I guess if you think of the reason I described the Odyssey at the beginning is because I think about life sciences as this entire ecosystem that's designed to serve pharma, right? So you have companies, so you have it's a pretty simple supply chain. If you zoom out, right, you have your picks and shovels, you have your infrastructure, your services, if you will. And that's pretty much it. And then you have the drug companies themselves. So life sciences is everything outside of the pharmaceutical companies. So you'll have your tools providers. You'll have companies that can help you make the drug, right? So there's bioproduction companies that'll help you make the drug substance. There's companies that'll help you make the injection pens and the infusion bags and things like that. And then you'll have the services layer. So there's two versions of that, or I guess three if you really want to break it down. You have your contract research organizations, CROs, which will do certain parts of the research for you. That can be early stage drug discovery if you want it. That's less popular. A lot more commonly outsourced is the clinical trials themselves. Over half of them are today. And then you have your contract manufacturers. The interesting part here is most generalists would be pretty familiar with a CMO. In biopharma, they had to add the D for development, which is basically where the manufacturers are helping the biopharma companies design the process by which the drug is made. So there's an additional layer of value added there. But the ecosystem can really be broken up into those. There's also this other offshoot, that is diagnostics, right? So everyone's had a COVID test by now. But the reason diagnostics shows up in this ecosystem isn't because it's just an attractive vertical to go into. It's that a lot of these tools are used to make chemical reactions, and chemical reactions are effectively the basis of a lot of diagnostics today, right? So all these picks and shovels providers that focus on R&D, they're really great at zooming in, telling you if something's there or not there. That's exactly what a diagnostic is. So you have this other piece that shows up in the mixes of a lot of these companies.
And so, do you have a favorite sub area? Like, are there certain business models within these spaces you'd mentioned, from like bioprocessing, CRO, CMO, and diagnostics, that you think is superior to any of the others?
Yes. I think it depends on your time horizon, but so I'm generally consider myself a pretty long-term investor when I think about these things. As I mentioned earlier, there is a cycle in the R&D piece, but the drug production piece is pretty secular. The reason that I prefer those spaces, really the secularity gets hidden in the cycle of the broader space. And I'll elaborate on that in a second, but I'll say that right up the last part up front is, I think my favorite place is bioprocessing. And that can show up in the contract manufacturing layer of the value chain as well. And I'm happy to start in either direction.
Yeah, let's start right there with bioprocessing.
Sure. So bioprocessing companies are the picks and shovels providers to biologic drugs or large molecule drugs. The original large molecule drug was a monoclonal antibody. Antibodies are just proteins. The way they're made is basically you have cells that produce the protein you want. So what you want to do is get those cells to multiply as much as possible, have them in a giant bioreactor, spitting out the proteins you want. And then you use equipment to go and filter out all the stuff you use to make those cells multiply and produce proteins so that you just have the drug left. Then you package it, then you ship it. Right. So the companies that make the equipment to supply that are quite attractive for several reasons. The one is the drivers. They're pretty secular, right? That's a great starting point. But the bigger piece is the regulatory capture element. Bioproduction and the fill finish companies are attractive because once you file to have your phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trial done, the FDA also requires that you specify what equipment you're using from which provider, right? So that creates early lock-in long before the drug is approved. So if you're involved in a drug that gets approval, they have to use you. That gives you pricing power. That gives you very predictable revenues because it's tied to the volumes, not the price of the drug. So even when the drug itself goes off patent and the price comes down, you're still charging the same for the equipment you use.
And then in terms of the amount of companies that serve the needs of the pharma industry and bioprocessing, like talk about how many there are and, you know, the varied roles that they may or may not play and how much they overlap with one another.
Yeah, so it's fairly close to an oligopoly. And what I mean by that is there are about 5 or 6 companies that really participate. They all have different product portfolios. And some of them have much smaller mixes that expose them to bioprocessing than others, right? So at the low end, you have a Thermo Fisher, for example, 10% of their revenue is bioprocessing, roughly. And at the high end, you have Repligen, which is a pure play. You also have Sartorius, which is mostly bioprocessing. Danaher is about 25%. And then you have Avantor and Merck KGaA. They each have smaller divisions within their broader mixes as well. And within that, each of them has exposures to capital equipment versus consumables. These are razor and blade models mostly. Some just sell the chemicals. We can get into that. And then there's also a variety of exposures on the clinical to commercial front.
I just want to give a brief plug at MOI Global's Best Ideas Conference last week. I presented Sartorius and talked about some of these dynamics. But so bioprocessing, right, at the highest level, you know, heading into COVID, everyone talked about it as a secular growth industry and was pretty confident that there would be little bumps along the way. COVID was viewed as this major accelerant, and today people are talking about it as a cyclical industry. So, like, what the hell happened here?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would take the other side of that argument most of the time. I guess in that last ramble, I went through. I did mention that things are spec'd in as early as phase 1 or phase 2, and that several companies within this oligopoly complex have different levels of mix toward clinical revenue, right? So as we mentioned, R&D is the cyclical part. These companies are not unexposed to clinical. The majority of the revenue in the space, about 75% or so, comes from late stage clinical trials and commercial drugs. That part, secular. The cyclical pieces are the other 25% that are clinical. There's varying degrees of cyclicality. The later you are in the clinical trial odyssey, the less cyclical you are. But there's also the capital equipment piece, right? So there were two pieces of cyclicality injected. This was all COVID driven. So you could argue that there were, if you think about the history of this whole space, it really got started in the early 2010s. We did have a biotech cycle, bubble popping in the mid 2010s. At that point in time, there weren't a lot of blockbuster monoclonal antibody drugs, and there was a lot of research and development revenue. So that cyclicality was bigger in 2015 than it is in 2025. Right. So it's evolving toward commercial. This happened with small molecules back in the day as well. But basically, the cyclicality piece that comes from clinical gets dampened as more of the drugs are approved, more of them are in the hands of patients. I think this is a good time to talk about what happened to the space with COVID. Basically, the way to think about it is vaccines were never really a huge part of bioproduction until we had the COVID pandemic. The mRNA vaccine happens to utilize a lot of bioproduction equipment. Everybody benefited a lot in 2020 to 2021 from that. However, there were other things that happened in tandem with that. So the contract manufacturers were making all these vaccines, were enjoying a massive influx of predictable revenue. Demand was super high. They were taking booking fees for capacity 3 years out, and they redeployed those dollars very aggressively into more CapEx, right? So there was a CapEx cycle that was introduced. At the same time, there was also a low rate environment that stimulated a lot of venture activity on much more speculative forms of drug. So you had R&D doing disproportionately well. All of this at the same time as the COVID vaccine was inflating bioprocessing revenues, right? So on the way down from that, 2022 is fairly predictable because you had this hangover of COVID revenues slowly going away, but there were other sources of revenue that were also over-earning. And that's what happened over the next 2 years, right? So we had a stocking event where, since the mRNA vaccines were soaking up so much of the bioproduction equipment demand, supply, they had to figure out, how much do we need, and let's order it 2 years in advance. The lead times were getting crazy. So everybody was over ordering outside of mRNA. So that was introduced after the COVID stuff started to fall apart. The space was expecting a recovery and then realized, everyone's got too much inventory already, and they'd never seen it before. So it became an issue that was hard to navigate because it wasn't like semis. There wasn't this common inventory cycle that everyone had seen before. The other piece was that capital element where all that overbuilding happened. And, probably one of the big drivers of the downturn this year was not actually that there was no recovery. It was that there was a recovery in consumable use. We got through stocking, but then we also had this hangover of too much CapEx happen in 2023. So it was a cascading effect of several headwinds that we're finally coming out the other end of, or at least that's the house view over at Borlaug.
Yeah, maybe explain a little bit that razor and blade dynamic where you'd end up with the equipment piece and then the consumables and how they become detached.
For sure. So with every step of the bioprocess, you're transferring effectively a soup with cells and protein into the next step where you do something to it. So at the beginning of the process, you have small bioreactors with disposable bags in them. We could talk about the single-use trend, but I think it's pretty well understood today. But basically, it's kind of like you're incubating these cells in a small trash bag, and then you're moving them to a bigger trash bag in a bigger vat. So you have to buy that bioreactor and the bag that goes in it. That's a razor and blade model. It's also protected by that FDA filing.
And yeah, single use. Let's just define that term now. Like, what's the difference between that and the way the industry's done things, and where's that going?
Yeah, for sure. So there's an upstream component where you're just making the drug, and a downstream component where you're filtering out the drug. The original blockbusters in biologics were made in much bigger scale capacities. And the way that was done was with a giant stainless steel vat. They went up to 50,000, in some cases, 75,000 liters. And then they were just emptied out into the next part of the process and sterilized inside of a giant stainless steel tank. This is extremely expensive. It uses a ton of water, electricity, chemicals, and manpower. What the industry figured out is that by inserting what is effectively a trash bag into the trash can, you have a disposable process, much less downtime, less spend on all that stuff. So you spend more on consumables, less on labor, energy, water, et cetera. And that's kind of been the trade. And as drug batches have gotten smaller, the economics have gotten even more favorable, right? So it's still not feasible today to make a 50,000 liter bag. But in some cases, running a 15,000 liter process with maybe a 2,000 liter bag up front, adding extra steps to create the use of disposables to remove time spent sterilizing steel is still economically viable today. And once your drug hits the 2,000 to 5,000 liter batch size mark, you're using almost exclusively these bags.
So yeah, now we have this dynamic, right? We talked about COVID. You get an appreciation for what pieces, like the bags in particular, there was too much stock of in the industry. The filters, everyone had too much of it. Some of the media and consumable pieces, everyone had too much. Why has this destocking taken so long? And then one piece I'd love to hear you touch on, like the longer it's gone on, I've actually heard from sell side analysts and from people who follow the industry, perhaps there's been a change in what had been a very consistent secular growth recipe pre-COVID to slower growth today. Like people are questioning underlying growth. So how do you think about destocking, why it's taken so long, and has there been a change with underlying growth? Is the industry structurally different today than it was before COVID?
Yeah, so previously mentioned the R&D bubble that popped because of the pandemic, and then destocking is a separate thing. But what there really are two compounding effects, right? So if the R&D dollars, the demand side, dry up or go cyclical at a time when everybody has a lot of inventory, that's kind of what extends it the extra, 3 to 4 quarters versus the original expectations. So that was the primary driver. The rest of it was fairly normal. So a lot of these pieces of equipment can be used for either clinical, preclinical, or commercial drugs, right? So if you don't have a lot of demand in R&D, you can send it over to commercial if you're big pharma. But given the way the industry is set up, where there's a lot of contract manufacturers, that wasn't necessarily the case, right? So you had all these biopharma startups all using small contract manufacturers to make their clinical trial production. They all had the equipment, and they were the ones with the supply glut, and their customers were going away. So what you had was this market flooded with things that could be used for clinical trials, the bags, the tubes, the filters, et cetera. And that really prolonged the cycle even longer, just given the funding had dried up. And, it's really a classic example. I think you're seeing it today in auto, in semis, where you have this demand falling apart right as the inventory gets too high, and it's caused a lot of pain over the last 4 quarters or so.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because if you listen to our podcast with Doug, we actually spent a lot of time talking about the auto dynamic. AI gets all the buzz in semis, but there's some really interesting, very parallel, similar trends going on. I think it would be helpful to talk a little more about the CMO role in this. I guess historically, pharma themselves had manufactured their own drugs, products. There's been this trend toward outsourcing. And there's this complex relationship where a CMO will acquire, let's say, plastic bags from Sartorius on behalf of a customer like Pfizer. And there's a little bit of a disconnect between what's going on, and it's not necessarily very clear, the connection between end use and where inventories lie. Talk about like outsourcing as a trend, how these relationships work, and, like, I guess within CMO, it's very capital intensive. So there's been this kind of consolidation and really large players emerging. So how does that interplay work with everything we've talked about in bioprocessing so far?
Yeah, so I think the most useful lens is to start with imagining yourself in the shoes of somebody starting a biotech startup, right? So you're basically convincing the venture capital investors to give you money, and you're going to spend it to get a drug into, through a preclinical trial or a phase 1 study before you go public, right? So you have to use that money wisely, right? And you have no certainty at all whether or not, or, as to whether or not the drug will work. Obviously, you're optimistic, but if you don't even know if you'll have revenues in 10 years, why would you spend money on CapEx if you don't have to? And that's what's kind of driven this shift toward outsourcing. A lot of things, were increasingly outsourced over the last 2 decades. And a lot of that was driven by the venturization of biopharma, right? So in the past, most of the new drug candidates came from big pharma. Now they're coming from industry. More than half are coming from the emerging biopharmas. All the molecules are increasingly coming from there. And it makes perfect sense to outsource. However, if you think about that from a project finance perspective inside a biopharma company or a big pharma company, the calculus is largely the same, right? You're willing to pay a little extra for that flexibility, just given the uncertainty around your drugs. So that's kind of given rise to the CDMO space. It's reached a point now where, while just over half of all the production is outsourced, the incremental usage of CDMOs is pretty close to 100%. If you talk to Lonza, they'll tell you this. There are very few large pharma companies building manufacturing capacity for biologics today. They're fully relying on the large CDMOs, specifically Samsung Biologics, Lonza, and WuXi Biologics, though we could get into the whole Biosecure Act stuff. But those are really the 3 big guys. There's another tier below that, but at the end of the day, most of the volumes are going to be done at those 3.
So does that concentration in ultimately who's manufacturing drugs change the nature of power for the bioprocessing companies because they're no longer dealing exclusively with a really fragmented industry?
I would say it really does. If price were more of a consideration, it would. But what's really happening is pharma bases their pricing partially based off of their costs, right? So what it costs to go through the R&D continuum and what it costs to manufacture. So theoretically, Lonza could charge whatever it wants, and pharma would just charge a certain markup that includes that kind of pricing, right? So that is part of the calculus that has allowed the outsourcing to happen. Drugs are, they're protected by IP when they come out. So that becomes a big consideration. I guess what you could say is changing is cost becomes much more of a focus when you lose exclusivity, when your IP runs out, and the generic versions of these drugs called biosimilars come to the fore. Once that happens, you're competing with companies that have brought drugs to the market that use the most efficient possible manufacturing footprints, which gives their COGS advantage a lever to pull price down on, right? So if you're big pharma and you want to keep your Humira sales or something, when you lose exclusivity, you care a lot more. And we're starting to enter that era.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but at the end of the day, although manufacturing is far more concentrated than in the past, the selection process, like when you choose which instrumentation to spec into your own drug process, remains fragmented. That research still is fragmented. It happens at the company level in the R&D process. So that there's a lot of inertia once those decisions are made. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I think most of the products that end up getting sold are still sold by the oligopoly at the top, but there are companies that enter the market. Some of them are public today. They're much smaller, and their path to growth is really convincing somebody to use their product in their drug, getting spec'd in, and then betting on the success of those drugs, right? So you win share by winning total number of molecules and then having those molecules succeed. You could debate whether or not the components you sell have an impact on the likelihood of success, but generally they don't. What pharma and CDMOs care about really is this the cheapest way to do it as a tertiary consideration? But what they really want to see is reliable supply, perfect quality control, et cetera. And that's what usually gives an advantage to the scale players.
And I know you've mentioned the benefits of regulatory capture, but in this very early process, there's got to be something that's precluded other competitors from eroding share of the oligopoly. So what is it that makes for some persistence in the suppliers when the first decisions are being made?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define share, right? If you were spec'd into all of the big blockbuster drugs, and then you lost all your share for the last 5 years on new molecules, it wouldn't really show up meaningfully in revenue because so much of the total volume is still done by the commercial drugs, right? So it's really happening at those earliest stages. But what prevents that from being visible in the numbers is just really how long it takes to get a drug from phase 1 to commercial, right? You have to run all of those trials. And the only amount of bags I can sell, if I'm a bag or a tube manufacturer and I win a molecule and I know the drug's going to work, I still have to wait several years before I'm making a meaningful amount of that bag or tube for my customer. So that's the real barrier. Is like you're doing all this R&D, you're spending all this money on a commercial org, you're charging something that makes you roughly a 50 to 60% gross margin. The model doesn't really work without scale, and scale takes time. That's the barrier.
So in terms of scale, like have any like upstarts been able to take meaningful scale in the industry?
Some. I think you're seeing right now, Repligen is still predominantly a commercial, a clinically oriented bioproduction company, but their market cap is about 10 billion today. There's some other smaller players in certain parts of certain processes that have become somewhat large, but they're not profitable yet. Things like BioLife Solutions comes to mind, MaxCyte comes to mind, ClearPoint comes to mind. These are all companies that are subscale, but have that dynamic working in their favor.
And kind of relatedly, some of these companies you're mentioning, I'm quite familiar with. You've talked a
you know
lot.
them all, Elliot.
Yeah, I do. You've talked a lot about MABs, right? Monoclonal antibodies. MABs is the industry lingo for it.
Yep.
But these companies kind of deal in newer modalities. So there's been this big evolution in the industry towards some of these newer modalities on the research side, not necessarily there commercially today. But like, how often has the industry evolved toward new modalities? How has this changed the landscape for the existing suppliers? Like, how important is that if one were approaching this industry from scratch today?
Yeah, I think cell and gene therapy, or we'll call them advanced modalities for simplicity's sake, because it'll include things like mRNA. They're a little bit over glorified today. Not to say that there's no justification for any interest, but it's important to understand kind of the historical cycles. And we can debate whether or not those cycles sustain or change over time. But basically, if you think about the odyssey that all these early biologics had to go through, the 2000s were a time where most of them weren't working. And that's really just a lack of understanding of the science. But as they got better over time, these companies iterate. Those drugs started to work. They started to make their way through the clinic. They became safer, more efficacious, more consistent. And now they're a blockbuster category today. But they were failing 20 years ago, right? So the next wave of that is really antibody drug conjugates, which were a nothing burger 10 years ago. And you're finally starting to see a lot of those billion-dollar drugs come to market. Cell and gene therapy, you could argue, is at the very beginning of that. We've only been seeing this category for maybe 5 years, and a lot of interest was injected artificially by the pandemic, right? Like a lot of that risk-taking was putting dollars into cell and gene therapy, but these drugs don't consistently make it through phase 1 yet. So while the curative potential is really exciting, it's going to take time before the industry iterates on these drugs, makes them safe enough to consistently get into the clinic. And that's really the jump off point for when you could start to figure out how to make things work. You have to start with safety.
Is that why they're not making it through phase 1? That's where safety breaks down?
I think so. I mean, a lot of these drugs are injecting viruses or, altering your DNA. And one of the common side effects of that is that it creates an immune response. And that immune response can usually cause cancer or even, cause death. And the inability to control that has made it hard to justify investment in a space. And I think we're starting to see the early stages of figuring out how to mitigate that, either by turning off the immune system or making the drug less harsh.
So, people talk about the Nielsen hype cycle. Where do you think we are in cell and gene therapies on that hype cycle?
That's a good question, to be honest. I think just given the fact that the cycle has been somewhat perverted by the injection of risk-taking R&D dollars during the pandemic, it probably wouldn't fit perfectly on a curve. But there's also a bifurcation between the investors and the actual clinical community. Cell and gene therapy funding was not great last year. despite overall funding being really high. So you could argue that we're in some type of trough. And that's
by the way,
completely
don't
separate from
cringe
investor
because I said,
optimism in the category growing.
right, that's very interesting. Yeah, don't cringe because I said Nielsen. It's Gartner hype cycle. I don't know why I said Nielsen.
I understand.
But yeah, it's interesting because when I've talked to people practicing in the space, they're like, the science has never looked better and it's evolving in a very good way. Kind of what you were talking about, a lot of things not making it through phase one before, but now they're figuring out how to make things better and safer and suppress the immune system while getting the reaction you want. But it's almost never been worse in the stock market. And these are very different stocks than life science tools, talking more about the actual biotechs, like the really risky, more venture-like segment of the industry. Do you think that, if you had to put a time frame on when this stuff really starts to manifest as a revenue base for the bioprocessing companies, for the CDMOs, et cetera, like how long do you think it'll take for that to be a more considerable portion of their revenue base?
For some of them, it's pretty considerable already, just given the companies that have exposure to like a specific therapeutic category, or even just being overexposed to clinical, like Repligen. They already have it today, so it's already there if you want to invest in it. But I think the path for getting the actual R&D dollars to come in is really tied to the venture community. You can't rely on big pharma to be taking lots of risk at early stages. This is just generally not what they do anymore. That's what they did 25 years ago. But as the industries become venturized, you're more and more exposed to the actual venture capital cycle. So you could expand the aperture of what we're talking about to, it's not a great time to be a VC in general, right? Like there's a lot of dollars going into AI, but VC funds have underperformed, and we're still dealing with that hangover, just given how long the private equity fund lives are today. And that creates a difficulty with getting a new fund going. New VCs are getting very small percents of the dollars today. And those are the ones that would be investors in cell and gene therapy. Those are the ones that take risk. And the big funds want things that work before they start taking risks within a bigger portfolio. So you have this knock-on effect of the venture cycle really slowing everything down, even if the science is good. It's not as good from a safety perspective as something like an antibody drug conjugate. And that's just because the science has been there for longer. All the dollars are going toward, let's try AI, let's try obesity drugs, let's try ADCs.
So you mentioned AI, right? I mean, does that have an influence on this stuff? Has it been helpful in getting things through the clinic faster? How do you think about AI in the biotech and life science industry?
I think, so if you think about what AI really is, it's taking historical data and trying to predict the future with it, or predict the next thing, right? So there's a lot of pattern matching that was traditionally done by scientists. So while you can speed that up, you're really limited to what data you've already produced and how legible it is to an LLM. So I don't think it's had a huge impact today. If you wanted to look at some of the larger platform companies like Recursion, for example, I think the issue they're running into is they're really good at identifying a safe drug for a known target, but that doesn't really help guarantee efficacy. You don't have enough data for that in one place. If you had that, you might be better at it. But even then, you're still going after a known target. And most of the big breakthroughs happen when you discover a new target for a drug to latch onto. As far as getting things through the clinic, I would point out that the FDA actually recently produced some guidelines around using AI data to get around the animal study component of your preclinical process. And I think that's a pretty big step change if it works, right? And that's like usually where you know something's going to be safe. So if I had to summarize all of this, I'd say the first big change that AI will add to the space is that it's going to make it much easier to know in advance if your drug is going to be super toxic to a person. You might still run into safety snags, but that's where it's taking most of the risk out. And that's a good thing. But it's not really guaranteeing efficacy in the future. It's not enabling other therapeutic categories just yet. But if you think about what we just talked about in cell and gene therapy, where the issue is safety, you can see a path toward a much better clinical odyssey where you start focusing less on safety because you took that part away much faster, and you start moving on to the efficacy component in phase 2 and 3.
And you save a lot of monkeys along the way.
A lot of monkeys.
And, one of the areas I'd been very intrigued about with AI, it seems like, genomics, when a drug has a known genetic origin when it's approaching the clinic, it has a far higher likelihood of getting approved than when it does not, which seems like obvious. But with genomics, one of the quotes I'd heard from someone in the industry is that like all the low hanging fruit has basically been harvested, and now we have a big data problem, and you have these massive troves of genes, and it's changing from linear relationships to complex relationships in terms of what will or will not work. Like, do you think that'll have a profound impact, or is that a little more industry like jargon and hype at work?
In theory, it would be the thing that reduces that bottleneck to discovering what your next target should be, right? Like you want to understand the relationship between what's in your genes to what's being expressed and what ends up in the proteins in your blood, right? Like those things can be instrumental for certain diseases. That's not always the case. If you take AI out of the equation, though, we've also had a pretty big breakthrough in the omics already. Before we had LLMs, we had single cell kind of happen in the late 2010s. That's become a big thing today where it's almost reached maturity. Then you've had proteomics, which is a big deal. We didn't have the equipment to analyze the entire proteome. We still kind of don't, but we have a much bigger access to the panel of all proteins in your blood, even the ones that are harder to detect, right? So with those data sets, even without an LLM, you're discovering a lot more. And I think what it's driving the most breakthroughs in is cardio and neuro, where we've traditionally done more poorly in drugs. Right, like oncology is pretty well understood. People are already doing genomic tests to decide which therapy they get.
This omics stuff you're talking about is really interesting because, like you'd mentioned before, diagnostics has this kind of nexus with research. And so when you're talking like proteomics and spatial, specifically, you're talking about its value in the research side of the equation, but inevitably it could have value in the diagnostics side of the equation as well. Yet most of these companies have not been great investments the last few years. Maybe talk about that dynamic a little bit, how that flows into research, how we're harvesting that, and whether inevitably, I think we're talking right now this week, Larry Ellison talked about the future where you'll have a diagnostic that could sequence your specific cancer. You'll use AI and build this mRNA vaccine that they'll inject into your body. Like, is that vision crazy? Are the tools there to kind of fulfill that? And, is that a 10-year in the future, 20-year, or will it happen in our lifetimes kind of thing?
I would never bet against innovation enough to say it won't happen in our lifetimes, but I do think it deserves, a grain of salt to be taken with it. mRNA was kind of a nothing burger before the pandemic. There's a big debate about how efficacious those vaccines were. We don't really have a big therapeutic in commercial land just yet to help us with anything coming from there. But if you think about the convergence of these diagnostics and what a cell, a gene, or an mRNA therapeutic are trying to do, they kind of have a big point of intersection, right? Because what you're doing is basically saying, I need to change X, Y, or Z gene or X, Y, or Z part of the proteome somehow. How do you know if you have to do that in the first place? You need a diagnostic test to tell you it's there. So it kind of goes hand in hand, where you're using it to both discover the genetic or transcriptomic drivers of disease, but you're also, using it to figure out if you have it in the first place. So it has this dual utility.
So, like, can you use the same tools in research, or do they have to be like repurposed and you build like is it very different trying to find a needle in a haystack, or when there's like a no needle to pick that out of the haystack?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is you do use the same equipment, but the companies that are commercializing the genomic test today usually add something to them. And what I mean by that is there could be a machine learning algorithm, right? A lot of these were in the clinic before LLMs. So a lot of it is just giant regression models on what the sequencer is producing. But if you understand the workflow of a gene sequencer, for example, you do have to prepare the sample before it goes into the gene sequencer. So the single cell innovation was actually a component of what happens before you put something into a gene sequencer. You're labeling all the cells so that you can see which cells are different instead of just taking the average, things like that. So if you alter the sample preparation or library preparation processes, which is a whole other rabbit hole we can get into, that's kind of the secret sauce. I would argue that it's not going to matter as much over time. I think right now it's really just doing the combinatorial problems, but in the future, you can narrow it down to just a few things that you can look for in a more targeted fashion. So the equipment that you use to diagnose the same thing could be different in the future.
Do you think, like, Illumina, one of the flagship companies in the space, they had bought this company, Grail. Grail's no longer part of Illumina, but like the idea being eventually we'll have this like cell-free DNA test where you take a sample of your blood and you can find if there's a cancer lurking in your body before you would on more invasive or more expensive or more challenging tests that we have today. Like, do you think that vision's a good one, that it's really going to happen? And would that change the nature of how we develop drugs as well?
I think cost is a big consideration when it comes to diagnostics, but I guess the important context here is it really matters what you're looking for. So there's screening can mean two things. It can mean I'm screening for everything related to the genome or a lot of different cancers, for example, and that's the Grail test. But you could also be doing something like Exact Sciences or Gardner doing, where you're running that same test, but you're targeting it for just one cancer. Right. So the difference matters because today, the targeted ones, the ones that are looking for just one type of cancer, are far more accurate than the ones that are looking for everything. So the holy grail, pun intended, is to be able to have a test that can accurately tell you that you have any type of cancer on one test. Right. But the problem today is they're only about 40% accurate. And that's not good enough to justify insurance paying for it.
Do we need to move past just DNA and get into some of this other omics stuff to make a more accurate test?
You know, it's probably the case, right? Because like you'd have to go into each different type of cancer. I know cancer is an umbrella term that's used, but it really is a bunch of different diseases, and the drivers might be different. So if there is a genomic driver of a certain cancer, that doesn't mean there's a genomic driver of every cancer, at least not one that's easily found in a sequencer. You know, that could be something that's solved by single cell, like transcriptomics. Like, is the gene, expressing itself properly? And like that could be upstream from proteins. But at the end of the day, the proteins are the output of everything that's happening in the genome. So you could argue that maybe you need to add proteomic data to that test, or maybe the real answer is if you can capture the entire proteome accurately, that's also an even better way of capturing cancer or any disease for that matter. So it's unclear today, but that's kind of where all the research is moving. All the R&D interest is slowly moving towards either proteomics or multi-omics, which is really understanding the relationship between all the omes. But it's all moving down away from the genome because we've done so much research already on what's in the human genome and how it affects disease.
And I just want to take a step back and acknowledge, you'd mentioned in diagnostics, it's a little more venture-like than some other parts of the industry. And I find these questions and this topic that we're talking about right now absolutely fascinating, and I think it's going to have amazing consequences for all of our lives. But like, how could or should or would a generalist approach investing in these areas? Or is this why you think bioprocessing is so uniquely situated within the life sciences area for investment?
Yeah, with my long-term cap on, I'm really excited about the benefit to patients that this space will bring. But if you think about what we're really trying to do, you're trying to diagnose a disease. And there's nothing stopping somebody from diagnosing the same disease a different way. So your protections are much smaller from an IP perspective, right? So the Grail test could become 80% accurate at capturing all cancer using the genome. And if I can do it with a proteome for cheaper, then I have a better test, right? So the pricing component in the very long run will be a race to the bottom. Today, we're just in the early part of the TAM penetration curve. That's why Natera did so well last year. These are really big markets, and the cost of making these tests is high today, and insurance is still paying for it because it saves money to the system. However, that's not going to last forever. So it's really important to try and identify, is there something unique about a test, or are you really just there for 3 to 5 years because you know that for the next guy to enter the market, it will take at least that long? You know, there is a first mover advantage, it seems, in this space, right? Like Exact Sciences has done really well with Cologuard. Natera seems to have taken much more of the market in MRD than Gardner did because they were first. Those things matter, but the moats are a little thinner, and I prefer bioproduction because of that FDA spec-in element. You could compare it to like a TransDigm or a GE if you wanted to go to another sector where the regulatory barrier of switching a component is much higher.
So, with diagnostics, with with this futuristic diagnostic approach toward cancer. It's obviously the very early stages and the growth is exponential with questions about race to the bottom on price and who the winners are. But in bioprocessing, like, do you think we're still in the exponential growth phase of biologics?
I don't, honestly. Certain biologics, sure. Like if you look at the monoclonal antibody blockbusters at the big pharma companies, the growth is slowing down. There's still new products coming in, but if you add up all the monoclonal antibody sales from all the top 20 pharma company, you capture 85 to 90% of all the sales the industry checks pick up, and that's slowing down. Right, it grew about 11% in 24. I think my model suggests it'll slow down to about 7% next year. That's the commercial mAb stuff. But that doesn't account for all the other stuff. That's just the existing drugs slowing from 11% to 7%. Some of that is price probably, right? So the volumes are really slowing down. However, you also have biosimilars. Those require the same inputs. Those kind of take over. So if you're spec'd into the old blockbuster drugs, your sales have a headwind in front of them. If you're not, and you're just spec'd into a biosimilar, it's a great time to be alive because that space is growing 20+% a year just by virtue of taking what's left in the market at lower prices, getting insurance to kind of push you, PBMs to push you, things like that. So it really matters like where you are in the continuum. And it's hard because there's so many drugs out there.
Is this a law of large numbers problem for the industry? Is it a kind of like, call it a hiccup in a longer term growth trend that'll resume once we have some better discovery and approval rates? Or, how do you think about kind of the arc over the next, call it 20 years versus where we are today?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of take it back to what the real drivers of the volume component are. And it's really just aging, right? So you have like GDP is a couple percent, and you stack the aging benefit, maybe that's 2 to 3% because the costs are exponentially higher when you live longer. So the biggest part of your life where you're the most expensive to the system for all the reasons that biologics help is an extra year. And if you extend that from 5 to 6, it's pretty big, right? So that kind of gives you this easy 5, we'll call it 4 to 7% wide range algorithm for volume growth. This FDA spec in element gives you pricing power, right? So drug companies raise their prices. We all know that. But so do the bioprocessing companies. And since they have a captive customer passing that cost through, there's no real debate there. And you get an extra couple percent. And it can be higher when inflation's higher. So that's the other piece. And that's kind of how you build to the industry should grow high single digits for a very long period of time. If you have better exposures, it's going to be higher. If you have worse exposures, it could be lower because that's the aggregate blob. And if you're spec'd into all the old commercial stuff, you're not really spec'd into the average of all that.
And let's say you are a supplier to a drug that loses exclusivity, and then a biosimilar comes to market, and you're a supplier to that biosimilar. Mm-hmm. Will you make the same money supplying the biosimilar approach that you do the exclusive on-patent approach, or are pricing dynamics different?
No, not even close. So the original small molecule drugs have this problem today where the minute their IP runs out, 3 or 4 generics enter the market. They're much cheaper. They can slash prices by half or more. And that's generally what a company like Teva will do. Biosimilars is pretty similar. They cut prices by anywhere from 40 to 50% as well. And they take the lower total profitability. But in order to compete with that, you have to make a hard choice. Do you just cut your prices? Or do you keep your prices and lose the volumes? And the choice that most of these guys make today is to kind of try and perfect the art of riding the cost or the price curve down to an optimal level. And what's happened so far, based on a lot of what the sell side research is showing, is that they'll cut prices pretty aggressively and the volumes will stay flat. But flat is still much slower than they were running before.
Well, sorry, I think what I meant specifically, let's say you're Sartorius and you sell to AbbVie for Humira, but then Teva makes a biosimilar. Like, will Teva pay a different price for the same materials than would AbbVie?
Yeah, understood. So the first part's still useful context because what you have is if you're spec'd into both, right? Let's pretend you're spec'd into both. You have that big base of revenue that's not growing, but you're getting this new biosimilar capacity that's coming on. Both will have to take the same price from you. That first part is non-negotiable. Everyone charges the same price to everyone. They have the same pricing power over each other because of spec-ins. However, what's different is biosimilars are using more modern processes, right? So if your cell line is more productive, you can make more drug with the same capacity, and that uses less of the equipment. So even though the pricing is the same, the total incremental benefit per volume of drug is less.
Why doesn't the whole industry just move to that lower cost structure anyway?
Well, it's trying. You see Roche and Regeneron are both aggressively experimenting with better cell lines. So it's happening even on the legacy products. It's just harder to see, underneath the surface, and different product categories do better and worse when the cell lines are more productive. Repligen is offering a solution to kind of make drugs more productive as well. So it's happening. It's just happening really slowly. And given the growth of the industry and the size of the clinical stuff moving through, it's really hard to capture it in just a bunch of revenue numbers reported by companies. But I do believe it's happening, and I believe that the headwind that is pushing on the legacy part of the industry is getting bigger.
And I wanted to circle back to the regulatory stuff, because you've cited that as one of the really advantageous elements of these businesses. But like today, most of the headlines that come out about the regulatory side seem a little ominous. Remember the week that RFK was announced as the HHS nominee, basically every stock in the whole industry went down double-digit percents. And we hear about, questions about geopolitics and selling to China, whether you can or can't. And, all these companies talk about China being a big problem for them. Like, what's happening on the regulatory side? Is that something that, you've said it's a source of moat, but could it be the opposite over the next few years and months?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the short version. For bioprocessing, I don't think it's anything but a benefit. For the rest of the space, it might reduce the total number of dollars moving around. So when RFK was announced, I think the reaction was really hysteria. He talked about being anti-vaccine, and he hated on Moderna a lot. So a lot of companies with exposure to that did incrementally worse. A lot of CROs get the most high quality parts of their revenue growth from vaccine clinical trials. So that's why you saw a little bit of hysteria, everything sold off. Turned out in hindsight, it was a great buying opportunity as people started to kind of think about what those policies would be. They started to realize it was going to be more focused on the food side of things. I really believe that it's going to be predominantly focused in food, because that's where the real drivers of all these problems come from. But there are regulatory things changing, right? So I mentioned earlier that the FDA came out with draft guidance on how to get around your monkey study using AI or data to show that something's going to be safe in a phase 1 trial. But they also had another piece that talked about if being forced to run a clinical trial, for example, much sooner if you got an accelerated pathway. So if you had an accelerated approval because your drug is serving an unmet need, what was happening was they'd get it on the condition that they'd run a confirmatory trial down the road. However, there was no enforcement to whether or not that would happen. So these phase 4, quote unquote, clinical trials just weren't being run in a timely fashion. So there could be a bolus coming from that being much more strictly enforced. It probably wasn't a huge headwind of the growth of the space, probably won't be a huge tailwind, but it is a regulatory shift nonetheless. Another one that people are talking about but hasn't really found its way through yet is reciprocity with clinical trials. So right now, the FDA will accept data from a clinical trial study run in Europe or another country if the patient population meets a certain criteria relative to what they think the patient population in the US might be, right? So if you run your study in Southeast Asia exclusively, you risk having your trial completely thrown out the window, right? So what ended up happening there was a lot of preclinical studies and phase 1 studies were being run in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and then being run again once they were showing good data in Europe or the US to kind of confirm that. If that starts to become a lot more of a flexible regulatory environment, a lot of the dollars that were going there will just shut off overnight, right? I wouldn't want to run 2 phase 1 clinical trials if I didn't have to. So I think that's one of the bigger shifts that could happen, but is only being talked about today. But if you think about any of these things, from a deregulation versus bioprocessing perspective, you're not going to deregulate the spec-in element of bioproduction equipment because it's tied to the safety of the drug. If you switch to a Chinese supplier of bags without an approval process, there's a huge risk that it introduces. Even if you didn't have that regulatory framework, you just had the the manufacturing inspections from the FDA, you probably would avoid doing it at all costs. So I'm not really worried about that piece coming through. But if you think about this clinical trial, ease of getting approval situation, it actually benefits bioproduction, because while there will be less dollars going through R&D, that's because drugs are making it to commercial faster. And that's where all the volumes and revenues are for bioproduction.
Presumably, if there are less dollars going to R&D, but they're generating a higher ROI, I'd imagine you end up with actually more dollars going to R&D, not less in the end. Like, the second order effect is you get faster approvals, you prove out better returns, so you're more confident in allocating money to R&D if you're a mature pharma, and in venture, it creates more incentive to allocate to early stage and get the ball rolling. And I would imagine a positive feedback loop emerging from faster approvals that actually doesn't reduce total R&D dollars.
I would tend to agree with that, but with the caveat that we're in an environment right now where large pharma is already spending too much money on R&D and are actively trying to cut down or limit how much they spend. So that might actually just be a source of savings for them that they choose to keep and pass on to shareholders. As far as the venture industry goes, it really depends on what candidates you're funding. Like, if you might be able to say, okay, my $200 million check to a big platform company can now fund more clinical trials because they don't have to keep anything in the tank for the confirmatory trial, et cetera. That might be the case. But if we run out of candidates, that's a problem. So it's really unclear which direction it will go today. It really shakes out to, like, how much ROI do we get, and are we going to exhaust all the candidates, or does it end up just creating that empty pocket of dollars that need to go somewhere and end up in a cell and gene therapy trial, which is a good thing for cell and gene therapy.
Right, because I see your point on how inevitably there's a finite number of areas those investment dollars can be targeted. But within large pharma, and call it large biotech as well, there are some who are increasing investment, and those are the ones who actually get return on their investment. The ones who are reducing it are ones who, they just don't get return. So that's the end state of it all. You need to get a good return on your investment, right?
I don't think big pharma really focuses their R&D spend on return on investment, just because it's so backward looking over such a long period of time. I think what I would pay attention to today is those companies that are increasing their R&D budgets are predominantly companies with high growth top lines today, right? So they actually have more gross profit dollars coming in. And as a percent of sales, they could still be reducing their spend, but the sheer magnitude of revenue, gross profit dollars, is actually what's driving the increase in R&D spend. So when I say R&D spend is coming down, I'm not saying it on an absolute basis, but rather on a percent of sales basis. So if obesity drugs slow down next year in a dramatic way, that's going to be pretty bad for Lilly's R&D budget, because they'll be much less willing to spend all these incremental dollars because they no longer have certainty that they'll get what they thought they were getting.
Interesting. And one other regulatory effect, I guess, and it comes into play with Lilly too, who's been, I guess, a little more acquisitive than some others in the industry the last couple of years. Consolidation, right? M&A dollars have been really important for the bioprocessing industry, for biotech, pharma, for recycling venture dollars, and as a supplement to R&D. Like, it would seem with a with a better approach at the FTC, you could end up with decently more consolidation in all facets of the industry, which accelerate R&D dollars and which are beneficial to bioprocessing.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think a lot of what Lilly is doing on the M&A front is trying to tie up our IP landscape in obesity to kind of make sure that no matter which drug makes it through, they're the ones with the IP for it, both in orals and injectables. And I think that's kind of describing the nature of what they've done over the last year. For example, they bought a biologic, bimagrumab, last year, or was it 2023, which locks up like the biologic, higher weight loss, less muscle density loss, but you have to get it done through infusion drug. And they could shelf that if they want to, or that could end up being the way everybody wants to do things. It doesn't really matter, but that's their strategy. So that's part of their M&A approach. As far as everybody else, I think one of the issues with the idea that more M&A will just happen is you're hearing complaints from big pharma that the most attractive platforms in the US and Europe are just too expensive, right? So the industry is trying to front run M&A. So when something is more successful, more de-risked, they're increasingly bidding it up. And the more players that do that, the higher the market cap of said company becomes and the worse the projected ROIC is. So that's causing a problem for the Lillys of the world or the Amgens of the world who want to buy stuff. And they're saying that. They all said it at JP Morgan. They're complaining that we make the industry less attractive on M&A just by bidding things up we think will get acquired. So there's a paradox there. The other element is licensing. Licensing activity kind of spiked when M&A slowed down the first time. But the big category of drugs that's kind of coming to the fore today, ADCs, is also being increasingly taken out of China. So they're just reading our papers and running more targets than we are. More candidates than we are against the targets and coming up with ADC IP that gets licensed from Big Pharma. So the question now is, okay, so yes, it is easier from a regulatory standpoint to acquire a $2 billion biotech company. However, is that $2 billion biotech company something that used to be a $500 million biotech company that's just been bid up by public markets? Or is it really, something you want to buy? And then also, is it cheaper to just license specific candidates? And it seems like the licensing activities here to stay. But that doesn't mean there's no exit. It just means it's going to create an environment where if you want to take money off the table as one of these biotech crossover funds, you're really selling down stock in a public company that won a couple big licensing deals. And you're hoping that the price impact that created is akin to the M&A deal. And it sounds like that'll still be the case. So either way, the dollars are going to be recycled.
And talk about M&A and bioprocessing too, because like the really large companies in the space, like Thermo Fisher and Danaher, and even Merck, KGaA, the European Merck, have been built with a significant amount of M&A. And I pulled aside this quote from Mark Casper, the CEO of Thermo. He said, and at the same point in time, valuations have reset in a way that even with a large premium, you can get to very attractive returns, which I found super interesting because everyone in the space have been complaining, valuations haven't reset, sellers don't really want to sell when they have, and yada, yada. But it seems like M&A might be coming back to the bioprocessing space.
Yeah, he's basically telling you that it is a secular space with injected cyclicality. It's somewhat confirmatory, or at least there's another viewpoint that's confirming or agreeing with what I'm saying here, in that it'll come back. But I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of the value, even if you look at like a public markets company today, maybe until recently where we got this big wave of risk on in the market, but a lot of these things were at valuations that price bankruptcy as a possibility or infinite dilution as a possibility. That gets taken off the table when you acquire, right? Like the M&A synergies for small bioprocessing companies are massive because you don't need the sales reps, you don't need the accounting department. You can integrate the R&D function. It's actually really easy to do if you know what you're doing. The big guys all are very skilled at that. They all spend a lot on R&D as a percent of sales. So it can all be done. And I think that's what he's really getting at, is the market is creating this giant divergence between the viability of a public company if it never got acquired and what Thermo can pay and realize from a return on investment perspective. You can't take those layers of spend out in the next 5 years if you don't acquire it.
And do you think that'll help like Thermo's returns going forward as well, because they're going to be able to acquire these companies? Or like, how do you trust the acquirers to generate good returns when the prevailing view from most market analysts is that M&A is value destructive? Meanwhile, here are companies that have created value with M&A. Like, do you think that's still there for them?
I think in the short term, if you recognize that every other player in the market is going to hate on every deal that Thermo does, right? Like they got a lot of flack for the Olink deal. It's bad for short-term returns if you think they're going to spend a lot of money optically overpaying for things. However, that's going to create an opportunity to buy Thermo where their ROIC is expanding. So I think there's a tale of two stories there, and it really just depends on how the market reacts to the first part of that story. Right. And some of this could be organic, right? Like if Thermo bought a bunch of bioprocessing companies and their exposure went from 10% to 25%, there's a 5-turn difference between their valuation against Danaher today. Why wouldn't the multiple expand to reflect that? People like to pay for organic growth as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So maybe, in our closing time here, is there a favorite place, like what one or two companies that you would love to highlight for a generalist investor to maybe analyze and try to understand this space and find something worth looking at?
Yeah, I think so. With the idea that I'm biased toward bioprocessing, I think the two companies I'd spend the most time on today are Lonza and Repligen in reverse order. My favorite idea is Repligen, so I'll talk about that. But basically, if you think about all the stuff we were just talking about on improving the yields of biologics, both on legacy and biosimilar drugs, the move toward ADCs and advanced therapeutics, Repligen is at the clinical end of all of that, and they're hitting that inflection point where a lot of this stuff is going commercial, and a lot of the existing commercial stuff is moving over to processes such as the one that they enable with their ATF technology. So they just talked about this on their third quarter earnings release, and I think people should really spend a lot of time understanding the ATF technology.
Yeah, maybe talk a little about that. Like, how does that help make this process better?
Sure. So if you imagine the legacy stainless steel bioproduction process, you can't change it. It's making 50,000 liters of drug substance, and you're competing with these biosimilars who are making 2 to 5,000 liter vats much more efficiently. They're using those single-use bags. They're having a field day with you on the cost front, right? So you can only change a few things with relative ease. It all costs a lot of money to do, so it has to be worth it. So historically, what everyone's done is made research and development efforts to improve their cell lines, make the cells more productive of proteins. That's kind of been happening over the last decade. What Repligen's technology does is allow you to put a single-use bioreactor in front of a much larger stainless steel, or just use it in lieu, to continuously produce drug substance while filtering out all of the media and feed and things that you had to do to get the cells to produce more. And the result of that is that there are a higher density of cells in the bioreactor spitting out the protein you want in the final bioreactor. So what that ends up leading to is you can do an entire run less, or 2 runs or 3 runs less for the same amount of drug. And that's a huge step change in productivity. And the reason it matters today is because historically, with this whole spec-in dynamic, you would have thought this is only going to happen for new drugs. But what Repligen revealed on their 3Q call was that they actually did it for an existing blockbuster and have agreed to do it for another, right? So in a world where everything moves over to their ATF, if you extrapolate this, it actually has a huge impact on who wins and loses in bioproduction. And I think Repligen's the winner.
So yeah, I mean, if we could explain 2 of the knock-on consequences, one of them you said, right? You get more single-use
Yes.
penetration in the industry. It leads the industry to keep moving towards single-use, and there's specific winners out of that. The other one, I think I'd highlight this point. Danaher, I've kind of joked that it was Larry Culp's parting gift to Danaher when he took the role at GE. They bought GE Bioprocessing, and GE Bioprocessing owned this incredible asset, Protein A. It's basically the most expensive piece of the entire process, and it's part of the what we've called the downstream. And so with more efficient upstream, which is what you're saying Repligen is able to help accomplish for the industry, you actually need less Protein A. So the big cost savings happen by cutting out the most expensive piece, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things, right? So what's happening when you introduce these new processes? There's also this whole other tangent we could go on about perfusion, but it's pretty similar to ATF, where the theme is the same, where you're trying to run a continuous process that maximizes the number of cells in the bioreactor producing stuff. So that has the effect of saying, okay, so whatever comes out of the bioreactor is a higher percent cells, their waste, and the drug. It has a lower percent of media because it was already filtered out, and anything else that you use, like growth hormones and stuff, all of that has been filtered out up front, or at least more of it. So the result of that is you need more filtration and less chromatography. And chromatography uses all of that Protein A. So that's the dynamic that you're describing. And it's actually really impactful. So the company that's most exposed is actually Danaher. They have about a third of their revenue in chromatography and bioprocessing. So that's what, 7-8% of their total? 8-9.
And you mentioned something interesting here as well. I think it might have to be its own podcast, but as things stand today, the industry predominantly manufactures in what's called fed batch. So each batch of end product is a discrete batch. It has its own, call it serial code attached to it from beginning through end, and you know exactly when things were produced. in basically every other industry, you have far more harmonious and what is now called continuous manufacturing processes. You never have to shut off your assembly line and everything's just made like every day, constantly, 24/7. The technology is there in bioprocessing. The technology is not deployed universally or largely at all in a lot of respects in the industry. And, maybe how far away are we from the day when basically everything is manufactured in this continuous way? And, how big would the consequences be?
For fully continuous, it could be a decade. You hear like the Repligens of the world talk about this a lot. It's very far away because it's hard to have every step connect continuously and still provide the same level of rigor when it comes to quality control. However, that is the direction things are headed. So any step that you can make continuous saves money. You're replacing the cost of headcount and downtime with more consumables. So this benefits bioproduction, especially the bag companies, especially the filter companies. However, it takes time to have that happen. It's a huge lift for the legacy commercial drugs to move over to some of these processes. But an example being ATF or a new cell line, those are actually things that are doable because they're not too much of a lift. And the ROI on the cost of refiling with the FDA is actually there. Perfusion, on the other hand, is something you might have to start with, but it is increasingly popular. I think you told me your talk with Sartorius showed that about a third of their bioreactor sales are going toward perfusion now. That's pretty meaningful, right? The incremental new capacity coming on is already a third of the way there.
And so Repligen's ATF, right? I think one of the interesting facets here is that it is really valuable in moving toward this middle state before we go fully continuous, but also it is a critical technology in going to continuous. So it's like in both worlds, it exists in a very prominent role. Is that right?
I would say so. I guess it remains to be seen. Like there's other approaches that don't use it, but still try to have a continuous process, like Evotech, for example. Their manufacturing approach is we're going to do small batches in a continuous way. If that works, that could be another way to get there. And that kind of goes back to like my problem with diagnostics. Multiple ways to hammer the nail without using a hammer could be a challenge. But I think today, just given the contract manufacturer diagnostics, all the projects going to Lonza, Samsung, and Wuxi, you're going to know long in advance what's popular.
And what's wild to me is that all the technology exists to go to continuous, but yet, you've been deep in the weeds here, and it's hard to say it'll happen within a decade, really, for ubiquity in the industry. It says a lot about what's great investing in this space, but also what's wrong with our regulatory regime. I think it really helps generate visibility for some of the companies in the space. You could see which ones are able to win today, but also well positioned for the future, and gradually continue to gain share. So what starts as a pretty good high single digits growth algorithm, you could start finding these companies that have good low double digit growth algorithms in between.
Yeah, I would agree. I think just having visibility to high single digit growth for a very long period of time is extremely valuable. You've seen it show up in the multiples of companies like West and IDEX and other parts of the chain or other industries. I'm sure they're not the only ones, right? So there is a value that you can assign to that. And I think that's part of what makes Repligen attractive. I guess maybe it's worth talking about valuation a little bit on that one. Optically, the multiple is like 95 times earnings, but it's important to point out that they're under earning by over half, right? The forward operating margin for their business is 15% in 2025. But the incrementals they did in 2019, 2020, and 2021, while heavily investing in their business, were still above 30, right? So the earnings number is depressed by a large amount. Danaher is at the high end of the group with mid 40s operating margin at peak. So that kind of gives you a sense of how much they're under earning by. So you combine this durability of growth in front of us because of their products being the go-to for improving your yields, not being anchored to the existing commercial drugs, combined with this undervaluation, I think gives you a long-term IRR that's pretty attractive.
And accelerating growth at the end of this destocking phase.
And accelerating growth. And it's unclear what the clinical snapback will be in 25 or 26, but I think you can get to pretty significant upside compared to consensus without it.
So there you have a really interesting idea. I was really excited to have John on this podcast because he does a fantastic job demystifying the space and making it accessible to us generalists. So I hope you've all been able to find considerable value. I'd hope you reach out to me and John, find Borlaug on Twitter. We'll link to John's blog as well as John's Twitter feed in the show notes. So hopefully you reach out to both of us with your questions on the space. And I'd look forward to having John back on again sometime soon to really talk through what's happening. We'll have some earnings from some of the bellwethers to the industry pretty soon. We'll get a much clearer sense of whether destocking is behind us or not, and then could really hone in on what the right growth rates are for each of these respective companies. So thank you so much for joining us today, John. This has been awesome. Really looking forward to getting this one out there.
Thanks, Elliot. Appreciate the kind words.
Thank you for listening to This Week in Intelligent Investing, brought to you exclusively by MOI Global, the research-driven membership organization. Learn more at moiglobal.com.